Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the Pork Queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady in the Brady Dental Care Studio, and today I'm joined with LaNisha Cassell, the Executive Director of the African American Museum of Iowa. We're talking Juneteenth and what that all was and what went down. Thank you, LaNisha, for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it as well.
So before we get started, everybody, remember, we have incredible Iowans for you every week on this show. We do half an hour deep dives where we're constantly bringing you great information. The only thing I ask is that you subscribe and rate the show. That's it. There's no way to pay. This show is never paid. It's free, and all we ask is you subscribe and listen and tell 10,000 of your neighbors. So, LaNisha, thanks so much for coming on this show. One of my amazing jobs on the Iowa Podcast is to ask the questions that no one else wants to ask, or they feel stupid not asking them, and now they don't know what to do. So let's start broadly for all those who don't know. We've been hearing all about Juneteenth last week, but maybe some person does not know the full history. Maybe they don't know what Juneteenth is. They're maybe a little too embarrassed to ask. So what is Juneteenth, and why is it so important?
Well, I'm glad you asked. And there really isn't any question that's too easy or stupid to ask. I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with Juneteenth. It's one of the many things that have been left out of our traditional education system in many areas. I don't want to say that broadly has been left out everywhere, but Juneteenth is the name of, or the combined June and 19 for June 19th, 1865, which is when the last of the enslaved Black Americans were freed. That was in Texas, Galveston, Texas, that is 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. And the celebration or commemoration has been happening literally since June 19th, 1865. And so the museum often, every year, celebrates and commemorates with activities that are educational and celebratory.
Yeah, I think some people believe that, as you pointed out correctly, the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, and an overly simplistic view of United States history says we had an ugly period, and then January 1st, 1863, we made everything right and everything was okay. But it wasn't actually that simple, as you pointed out, not until June 19th of 1865, from January 1st, 1863. That's a lot of time. Not until then did the celebration start of freeing of the slaves. So why did it take that long? I think there's a lot of context here that, as you point out, maybe the American history books didn't go too far into.
Well, there's so much to unpack there, but I'm not. It was, it's a money thing, obviously, and it's a dehumanizing thing. So there was reason that the enslaved people weren't told us because the slave owners didn't want to release them. And that's exactly why that happened. And so it took that long for word to finally reach. And then, of course, let's not talk about enforcement of freeing of the enslaved people, too. So there's a lot behind that. But in simple terms, it wasn't beneficial to let the enslaved people know that they were free.
Sure. And was there like a states' rights issue that got involved as well? Because the Emancipation Proclamation, obviously there was the Civil War. Are there also, and I don't actually know the answer to this, are there also legal reasons it took so long too? Or was it pretty much just people were resistant and held out?
There may have been. I really probably not the best person to do that deeper dive in terms of the legalities of it and the historical perspective. We do have historians on staff who probably could better answer that question, but I would certainly want to follow up with you and give you the answer to that question. But I imagine there was many reasons, but I think the bottom line is probably that enslaved people were not considered human and were not treated as such. And so it was very much a monetary thing, and there was no reason to want to get rid of what was making people money and helping them to survive, if you will, by releasing people who were working for free labor.
Right. Yeah, we were just in Galveston here last week, and we saw the plaque in Galveston because there's a permanent plaque on one. I can't remember the street name, but that's where like the celebration started, or I don't remember all the details.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I would have snapped a picture of it, but I totally didn't get it. But I was just down there and I was like, it was kind of we didn't plan it that way, but I was like, this is crazy. I'm standing on a piece of American history.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. I had to submit I did a guest column for the Gazette recently, and I was talking about Juneteenth, among other things. And one of the things I found interesting was that obviously if you're, from Texas, you probably got a lot more education about Juneteenth than maybe the rest of the country potentially. But there was a time when people were leaving Texas and going to other parts of the country. And so some of the celebrations to commemorate the history started to wane a little bit in Texas, but it was growing in other places across the country. And then in the early 90s, there was kind of a Juneteenth movement, if you will, where commemorations and celebrations started to see a resurgence. And so I think since then, and of course, the last couple of years since it's become a national holiday, there's a lot more attention being put on it by the general public versus kind of the commemorations that have happened by communities of color and the Black communities.
So you're obviously the executive director of the African American Museum of Iowa. And I think when it comes to the civil rights discussion, a lot of people are very quick to think of like the national figures like Dr. King, but I don't think a lot of them, probably not top of mind, are Iowans in the civil rights movement. So are there any Iowa names that come to mind when you think of civil rights here in Iowa?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Some of the people that come to mind right off the top, I think I mentioned earlier that I'm not the historian here, but because I've been with the museum for several years, I too am learning not just Black history broadly, which I wasn't taught, but also specifically Iowa history. Local figures to Cedar Rapids, for instance, people like Viola Gibson, who was an activist and who helped with allowing African-American people to be able to utilize public pools in Cedar Rapids and other areas. Always also big in the NAACP. There are people like Wynn, who was from Clinton, Iowa, and who was one of the first African-American elected officials in that part of the state as well. So there are quite a few. I can't name them all, but I would certainly invite people to go onto our website and to look through our collections, our digital collection, to be able to get more familiar with until we reopen some of our content.
And you just dropped a little secret there, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. But I do want to do a quick because there's a lot to unpack there as well. But I do want to do a quick overview of, it was a busy week. We're recording this on a Tuesday, which is the day after Juneteenth. For obvious reasons, you've been very busy. And so I wanted to ask, what are some of the things that were different this year and some of the programming that the museum put on that maybe not everyone's familiar with?
Sure. We did a lot of new things this year. It kind of ties along with some other things that are happening, but we're really trying to strengthen our statewide impact because we are an institution that has a statewide mission and vision. And so we partnered with some unique organizations this year. One was, and when I say unique, I don't mean different, but more that we haven't necessarily partnered with some of these organizations in the past. So with the Marion Public Library, which is kind of in our backyard, we had a story time that featured 2 African-American children's authors. And that was our kind of kickoff event on June 10th. And then a few days later, on June 14th, we partnered with Make It Okay, Iowa's Healthy Estate Initiative, to host a decolonized mental health program with a facilitated discussion right afterwards with leadership from Lynn County Public Health. And then on Friday night, we partnered with the Des Moines Metropolitan Opera for a 45-minute performance of Driving While Black, which was amazing. And then there was a facilitated panel discussion right after that. And then we kind of wrapped things up in person with our festival that was on this past Saturday at Nubo City Market. And our final event was last night, which was a pre-recorded interview by Dr. Ashley Howard of the University of Iowa as she interviewed the 1619 Freedom School staff in Waterloo. So we had a pretty full load over the last 10 days, and it was great being able to engage new audiences and to continue building relationship with the audiences that we currently already reach.
Tell me a little bit about that. You mentioned something kind of incredible this year, which was unique. I think this is the first time you did it. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But you partnered with the Metro Opera. First of all, was this the first year you did that?
It was. One of our board members, again, I mentioned that we were statewide. We have several board members in Des Moines, and one of them connected us with the Des Moines Metropolitan Opera. And I think we had a 45-minute initial meeting. And I told them afterwards, I was kind of sold in the first 5 seconds before they, went through the details. I mean, not very often do we get something like that where we are able to instantly hit our mission with something like this, a partnership like this. And so oftentimes people wait until it seems like it's more obvious. And obviously having a title of a performance called Driving While Black is obvious, but so many things are kind of isolated and wrapped around with a name that doesn't really tell you what it is. This one was right there in your face.
Oh, sure.
Telling you exactly what it is. It automatically resonated with me. And so we said yes immediately and started to plan for the event. And Des Moines went full stop and decided that they wanted to do it here and brought all of the necessary equipment, people, and audiences, in addition to the audience that we brought from Cedar Rapids. So we had about 150 to 175 attendees in the Cedar Rapids Public Library on Friday night. It was great. It was a great performance. It hit home with so many of the audience members. And it was definitely a mixed crowd in terms of ethnicity and culture. And the discussion afterwards was very engaging.
So you actually, this is really cool. They brought their equipment and their voices to you.
They did.
That's very cool.
It was great. And they're doing 3 more performances. This is the only one that's in Cedar Rapids. The other 3 will be in Des Moines. And I might have to take a trip and go see it again. It was that good.
What you mentioned that you had the Driving While Black opera with the Des Moines Metro Opera, which is a blessing for Iowa having them here. We're very appreciative. For those that have not been to an opera, shame on you. Get to an opera. They're absolutely, the power of the human voice is unbelievable. Like if you've ever been to a musical program, that's one thing. Like having a singer, listening to a singer is one thing. But when you hear an opera singer, it's eye-opening how much power they really have. I want to talk about of course, the Driving While Black opera, but like you said, there was a panel discussion afterward. Tell me about that.
Sure. So we had I think they do this for all of the performances, but we were able to take the lead on securing the moderator and the panelists because it was in Cedar Rapids, and I have a little bit more of a network here than in Des Moines, which I'm working on. But we had 2 African-American men who were late 40s, 50s, and then 2 African-American women who were late 40s maybe, and then 70s. And so I liked it because we had a perspective of, obviously the focus of the performance was from a Black mother's fear and anxiety of having her children begin to drive. And so having 2 Black men who are the profiled people, and then having the women on the panel who were representing mothers from different generations to just demonstrate that this is not a new phenomenon or a new circumstance that we find ourselves in. So the conversation went from the fear and anxiety of not just parents, but also from the people being profiled, which could end up being parents later, right, of a new generation of children and adults who are being profiled while driving, and to ways that we can mitigate and how we deal with that fear and how we deal with educating the Black community about how to be in situations like that.
I mean, so what, were there good examples of that? Was there good discussion?
Oh, absolutely.
Were there any good questions that came from the audience?
A couple of people asked questions from the audience, but the actual discussion among the panel lasted most of the time. And I think there may be 2 or 3 questions from the audience, which I think we could have had another hour or 2 or even more. And so certainly conversations were had after the event was over too. But I think it really just got into digging deeper and understanding that this is not something that is an overnight solve. I mean, this is, what can you do as a community member, as an ally, as a neighbor, when you see something happening that is not right? How do people in the Black community guide their children to be cautious and come home alive, but not have their lives be on edge for their entire life? And so it was a very interesting conversation. And not just that, it was profound, and it resonated with most of the audience because there was a lot of people of color in the audience. And there were a lot of people in the audience who are allies. So I think it was certainly speaking to an audience who were already open-minded about the conversation. So it was great. I feel like we can do some follow-up discussions on this very topic as we move forward.
For maybe a Black mother then who's listening to this show, what were some of those, and obviously did not make the panel discussion, did not make it to the opera thing. What were some of the high level details? And I know I'm kind of springing this on you, but upon best memory, what were some of those high level things that they touched on? Well,
I think it's not too difficult to talk about because I am a Black mother. My children aren't driving yet, but they ride bikes and they are out in the community. And so some of the things that came, just the constant fear It's almost like you just kind of, that you're used to, kind of like when there's certain things that you might have, pain you might have because you're getting older kind of thing, and you just kind of get used to it. Well, those are the things that came out of the conversation too, that these are not things that we develop, one day. You're it's kind of ingrained, and that we have to always have those conversations with our children about how to be. It's not just about obeying the law, because we've already seen that you can do everything right and still not come home. And so talking about how we educate our children and teach them to make sure they are obeying, but also, unfortunately, we have to teach our children to stand down even when they're doing the right thing so that they do come home alive. So I think I heard some of the gasps of, maybe surprise isn't the right word, but I can't think of a different one right now, of white members of the audience who, don't necessarily, they've been pulled over before for things, but that whole idea of living in fear and anxiety every time your children get in the car and go somewhere is not something that necessarily on your mind as a parent. Remember the community who is not of color.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I think about that often, right, when I'm driving, to be honest. But one of the questions I do have just in general is, there is a lot of trust that I'm just, one of the questions I keep coming back to is, there is a lot of trust in law enforcement because they have the advantage, they have the backup, they have the equipment. And so there is, I will admit, sometimes a little bit of a concern. I'm like, how is it even possible for us to know who has our best interest at heart and who doesn't? And that's always kind of running through my mind. And obviously I don't have the problem of driving while black. Other people do. But that is one of the things that is tricky, is you don't know who you're dealing with when the blue and red lights go off behind you. Right. And so that is definitely, even someone like myself, a question that pops into my mind from time to time. Was any other topics that popped up during that panel discussion? Because I obviously have a lot more to ask you too.
Not necessarily. I mean, a lot of things were great about that conversation, and just kind of being able to, I don't want to say debrief, but just being able to air some of those concerns, publicly, and let other people kind of just sit with it a little bit who didn't experience those things. And definitely having someone who was older, Betty Johnson, who's into racial reconciliation. That's been something that she's been doing for years with her husband in ministry. And she's in her 70s, and she has grown children and grandchildren. And she talked about that fear that is her whole life since she's had children. So it wasn't like, oh, my kids are grown now, they're out of the house, I don't have to worry about it. She literally still has that fear today. And she's almost 80.
It's good
I think that was very poignant.
Obviously, we need to have more discussions like that, because what happens, sadly, in this day and age is, whenever you make a statement like driving while black, or anything that has to do with maybe politics or racial division or reconciliation, immediately the walls go up, everybody has opinions, and no one wants to change their mind, right? And so it's incredible that people are having these discussions in public, in a safe space where you can make comments and you can ask, what I would consider, sometimes when I ask dumb questions. That's when I learn the most. And so I feel like what you guys did, that panel discussion, is a critical missing component in our culture today, the ability to have those open discussions.
Absolutely. I would agree with you on that. And I think that, there are triggering things for people, when you hear driving while black, or you hear white privilege, all these things I think are triggering. But I think it becomes a triggering thing if you don't really understand the intent or the meaning behind it all. And if no one's ever said that white people don't get pulled over, or that white people have not had struggle. I think the message behind both of those things is that it's not because of the color of your skin. When you talk about societal and systemic issues, those conversations have been great. And
And those are obviously, something else we're going to do. We do with all our guests, of course, is that at iowapodcast.com, we'll put the show notes. We'll make sure there are links to your website so people can be informed of future discussions. So we'll definitely get that in there too. But I do want to go into the African American Museum in general, because this is obviously, well, I guess I should ask you, because you're the guest. When was it founded? Where was it founded? And where is it?
Sure. So we are physically located in Cedar Rapids, actually in historic Czech Nouveau Village, or Czech Village, New Bohemia. And in 1993, a group of church members from the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church here in Cedar Rapids kind of just were wondering, is there enough Black history in Iowa to have a museum? And lo and behold, they discovered there was. And so for about 10 years, they collected archives and items, photos, all those things that you would have in a museum, fundraised, and we're at various locations before landing at Westdale Mall in Cedar Rapids for several years while the first Capitol campaign was underway for the building that we're in right now. So the museum started in 1993, had our campaign in 2003, and moved into the building. And so we are celebrating our 30th birthday or anniversary this year, 30 years, 20 years in the building.
Congratulations.
And, 10 years before that of just existing and trying to do what needed to be done to have a facility.
And so you have a history.
And the reason
go ahead.
To just history, it was just, there was also this concern that the Iowa's Black history would be lost and not preserved. And so that was the kind of the main motivation behind establishing the museum.
Yeah. And you obviously have a history with water. Because in 2008, you guys you had a lot of damage, and then
we did,
which is interesting because again, flooding is reshaping the future of the African American Museum. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny, we have a flood marker, like a marker inside the building, and if I were to take my shoes off and stand by it, it would pretty much be at the top of my head. So I would have been underwater had I been in the building when that happened. But we were able to recover and renovate the building, and we're able to open back up in 2009. So thank goodness for community members who understood how important the African American Museum of Iowa is to our community, to our state. And we're able to recover a lot. And of course, the flood control system, aka the flood wall, is finally, over the last few years, been underway across the city. And a part of that wall is impacting the museum's facility and operations. And so the city of Cedar Rapids and the museum have been in communications probably since late 2019. And so the wall is coming through the parking lot. The wall is already done. There's a roundabout coming within that block. And because of the impact of the wall and how major it is, it made sense for us to tackle some of our other issues related to the building, HVAC and sprinkler system, our roof, and some other things. So in addition to a facade and reorienting our entrance, we're going to be tackling some of those other issues. And so we won't have a brand new building, but it'll look like it's been redone from scratch. So very excited about that, anticipating opening in February of 2024. Construction has already started. We had our groundbreaking just a couple weeks ago. So things are happening very fast.
Yeah, it's interesting that a 2008 flood kind of, ravaged the space. And now flooding again is going to be responsible, at least flood control is going to be responsible for renovating the space. Is that because the location, for those that haven't been there, is very close to the flood wall? And so some structural things had to change in your building? What was the tie-in there?
So it is very close to the river. But also, interestingly enough, Nubo City Market, which sits kind of lower, would actually flood first. So this flood wall or flood control system is protecting more than just the museum, but the Nubo Check District, which we lovingly call the district. It is a protective measure that's going to serve the larger community with its very complex, dynamic system. That's the underground component of it is amazing. We closed our building in August to the public. And we just moved out a couple of months ago. But all of the pile driving and all of the things that were happening before you can see anything happening on top was just fascinating and interesting and loud. And the vibration was interesting, too. But it's exciting. This has never been something that we've been like, oh, no, we're going to have a flood wall. Well, yeah, it's certainly going to look different. But because we were able to wrap in this renovation as well, I'm embracing this as a protective feature, but also a way to kind of revitalize the African American Museum, bring more awareness to not just our building and our resources, but to connect with more people across the state. We've been able to expand our reach. My last year has been spent outside of the building, outside of the community, across the state, trying to galvanize people to people who don't know that we exist, and for people who do know, for them to re-engage. So it's been a great year, and I'm very excited about our reopening. I know it's going to be exciting for our community and for the state of Iowa. We're the only institution like it in the state.
So what will people see? Like, what would have people seen? Or I guess, because we're obviously right now it's closed because of the renovation. So I guess this is kind of past tense, maybe a little bit. But what would people see walking into the African American Museum of Iowa? Like, what do they see? What activities are there? Can you give people kind of a little walkthrough?
Absolutely. And I hopefully I get to come back and tell you what people can see right now when we're closed too. But when we're open, people can come in. We have a gift store, and we have a lobby that has a welcome video. There's the flood marker that I mentioned. We have a library, an actual library, and an education office. But in our gallery, there's a permanent exhibit called Endless Possibilities, which traces African Americans from the West African slave trade all the way to Iowa. And so because our museum is Iowa focused, you're immediately in Iowa once you get into our permanent exhibit and get past the slave ship that's there. And so you'll be able to see Underground Railroad features, civil rights, some really unique things to Iowa, like Buxton, which is a very interesting historical piece that so many people who don't know about it are fascinated when they leave and ask many questions about it. And people who do know come just to see that part of our exhibit. But then and the permanent exhibit goes through to President Obama's inauguration the first time. And then our temporary exhibit, which is about a third or more of the exhibit space, and that changes annually. And our last exhibit that was there was redlining. It was called Mapping Exclusion Redlining in Iowa. And so we do community surveys to pick our temporary exhibit every year. So I said a lot there, but that's what people can see in the building. But we still have a presence right now too. Mm-hmm.
And you do have a presence right now as well. So people can come, even though it's closed, they can come right now and check out stuff.
So right now, they can go to the Cedar Rapids Public Library third floor gallery to see our current exhibit, which we also created a traveling version of it, which is traveling all over the state right now. And we have 6 copies of it, in addition to the installation that's here in Cedar Rapids.
Got it.
And we're also doing programming in virtual and in person. So lots of things are happening.
No kidding. So with our final minute, what does the new version look like? How can people contribute to it? And can you lay out that plan for us?
Thank you. So the new version will be a new entrance, which will, instead of facing the 12th Avenue Bridge, it will face 2nd Street, which is a little bit more community facing. There'll be a lot more glass, so it's open and welcoming, inviting. It's going to look very much contemporary and kind of fit the community a little bit more, the landscape of the community. Everything will have been touched in terms of upgrading. We'll have new lighting, new carpet, new ceiling, new walls, additional spaces, some reduced spaces, a customized reception area. It'll be a new exhibit, of course, because we'll be working to get something new up when we open. I forgot the second part. How to contribute. So on our website, blackiowa.org, you can go to our Voices Inspiring Progress page, which is our rallying cry for this campaign and renovation. And you can make a contribution there. And you can also see renderings of what the building will look like when it reopens.
And it looks really cool, by the way. I did look at those renderings. It looks really cool.
Seeing those, it's like it's real, it's happening.
Yeah. And LaNisha, congratulations for getting Black Iowa. Like, that's an amazing URL. It's so hard to get URLs these days.
I love it. That's exactly what it is.
LaNisha Cassell, Executive Director of the African American Museum of Iowa. Thank you so much for coming on the Iowa Podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me and letting me share.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa Podcast.